Dr. Mara Elise Voss had been the attending physician on the third floor of Whitmore Regional Medical Center for 11 years when the chart arrived at the nurses' station at 7:14 on a Tuesday morning in March. I was reviewing overnight labs when Sandra Ochoa, my head nurse, slid the intake form across the counter without comment. She had learned to read me well enough to know when something required silence. The name on the chart was Gretchen Voss, my mother's older sister. The woman who had stood at the head of a dining room table 22 years earlier and told me in front of 7 members of our family that I was not college material and never would be. I recognized the date of birth before I recognized the name. 1951. The same year as every story I had been told about how the family fortune was built, brick by careful brick, by people who were allegedly not me. I set the chart down. I picked up my coffee. I took one slow sip. Sandra was watching me from 3 feet away. "I'll take this one," I said. I had what they needed, I always had. They just spent 22 years making sure I didn't know it. Hello, everyone. Before I continue, if you've ever been told you would never amount to anything by someone who should have believed in you, leave a comment below. I want to hear your story. Because what I am about to tell you took me 2 decades to live and about 40 minutes to finally be ready to say out loud. But to understand why that moment meant what it did, why my hands were steady when I picked up that chart, why I felt something settle in my chest like a stone finding the bottom of a still lake, I have to take you back. 22 years back. To a dining room in a house that smelled like lemon furniture polish and old money, and a table I was never supposed to sit at as an equal. I was 26 years old. I had just been accepted to the post-baccalaureate pre-medical program at Calder University. It was not a famous school. It was not anyone's first choice. It was a second-chance program, designed for people who had come to medicine late, by the long road, through years of working in places like the administrative billing office of a mid-sized orthopedic practice, which is exactly what I had been doing for 4 years, while I figured out that the only thing I actually wanted to do was become a physician. The acceptance letter had arrived on a Thursday. By the following Sunday, I was at my Aunt Gretchen's house for what had been billed as a family dinner and turned out to be something else entirely. I found out later that my mother had told Gretchen about the acceptance. My mother, Diane Voss, was not a malicious woman. She was a woman who had spent her entire life seeking Gretchen's approval and had never once received it. And she had apparently believed, in a moment of optimism that I still find heartbreaking, that news of my acceptance would generate something warm. Something proud. What it generated was a family meeting. Gretchen sat at the head of the table. Her husband, Roland Pfeiffer, sat to her left with the particular expression of a man who has learned to agree with everything his wife says before she finishes saying it. My 2 cousins, Tessa and Burke Pfeiffer, sat across from me. My uncle Werner Voss, my father's brother, who had been handling the family's finances since my father died when I was 19, sat at the far end. My mother sat next to me. She had worn her good blouse. I remember that detail with a clarity that still makes my chest tight. Gretchen waited until the bread had been passed before she began. "I think we should talk about this medical school idea," she said. "Not pre-med program, medical school." She had already promoted it and dismissed it in the same breath. "It's a post-baccalaureate program," I said. "Pre-medicine, it's a first step." Mara. She said my name the way you say the name of a child who is drawn on the walls. Patient, tired, certain of the mess. Your father left the family trust in good order. Werner manages it responsibly. There is money available for education for family members who demonstrate the kind of academic foundation that warrants investment. You have a community college transcript and 4 years of billing work. That is not a foundation. That is a starting point for a certificate program. The acceptance letter disagrees with you, I said. Roland made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Post-baccalaureate programs accept anyone who can pay the application fee, Burke said. He was 24 and had just started law school at a program ranked 40 spots above his actual ability to complete it. He did not finish, but that came later. The family trust, Werner said carefully, because Werner was always careful, was established with the understanding that distributions would support endeavors with a reasonable probability of return. I am not saying this to be unkind, Mara. I am saying it as a fiduciary. How much is in the education distribution? I asked. The table went quiet in a specific way. The way that told me everyone already knew the answer. There is $47,000 allocated for educational distributions across eligible family members, Werner said. Tessa has already drawn $18,000 for her design program. Burke's law school costs are being managed through a separate arrangement. So there is $29,000, I said. There is $29,000, Werner confirmed. And the trustee committee, which includes Gretchen, Roland, and myself, does not believe that a speculative medical program for a 26-year-old with no science background represents a sound use of trust assets. I have taken 12 science courses in the last 2 years, I said. At a community college, Gretchen said. I looked at my mother. She was looking at her plate. Her good blouse had a small thread coming loose at the collar, and she was pressing it down with one finger, over and over, as though if she smoothed it enough times it would reattach itself. I understood in that moment that she had not known this was coming. She had not walked me into an ambush. She had walked herself into one and taken me with her because she did not know what else to do. That was the moment I made the decision. Not the decision to become a physician. I had already made that one, alone, in the billing office, on a Tuesday afternoon, when a 71-year-old woman named Patricia Coe had come in weeping, because she did not understand why her insurance policy had denied coverage for her husband's follow-up specialist appointment, and I had spent 2 hours on the phone with her carrier navigating the denial codes until I found the error, and when the coverage was reinstated, and Mrs. Coe stopped crying. I had felt something in my chest that I had never felt before in my professional life. The decision I made at Gretchen's table was different. It was smaller and harder and more specific. I decided not to argue. I folded my napkin. I set it beside my plate. I looked at Gretchen and I said, "Thank you for being honest about where the family stands." And I did not say another word about it for the rest of the evening. The next morning, I called the financial aid office at Calder University. The program coordinator was a woman named Helen Marsh. She walked me through every available option with the patience of someone who had spoken to 100 people in my exact situation. Federal loans, institutional grants, a work-study arrangement in the university's anatomy lab that paid $11 an hour. I wrote down the name of the emergency medical loan program on a piece of paper. I folded it and put it in my wallet. I kept it there for 6 years. I paid for Calder University myself. $43,000 in federal loans, a $1,200 institutional grant, and 3 years of anatomy lab work. I finished the program with a 3.91 GPA. I took the MCAT on a Saturday in April and scored in the 89th percentile. I did not call Gretchen. I did not call Werner. I did not call my mother until I had the score report printed and in my hand, and when I told her, she cried, and I held the phone against my ear and listened to her cry, and felt the specific loneliness of a victory no one in your immediate world is equipped to celebrate properly. I applied to medical school the following fall. I was rejected by 7 programs. The 8th rejection came from Harwell School of Medicine in February, and it was the one that broke something in me temporarily, because Harwell was the program that my pre-med advisor, Dr. Lionel Adami, had identified as my most realistic option given my non-traditional background. Dr. Adami was a 53-year-old internal medicine physician who taught biochemistry at Calder and had, over the course of my 3 years in the program, become the closest thing I had to a professional mentor. He had written my strongest letter of recommendation. He had reviewed my personal statement 4 times. He had sat across from me at a coffee shop on the edge of campus and told me, with the directness of someone who respected me enough to be honest, that I was a strong candidate with an unusual profile and that I should expect some rejections but that the right program would see what he saw. When Harwell sent the rejection, I called him from the parking lot of my apartment complex because I could not make myself go inside. "How many more applications do you have outstanding?" he asked. 4, I said. "Then you haven't been rejected yet," he said. "You've been rejected by 8 programs that weren't the right fit. Those are different things." I did not believe him on the phone. I believed him 3 weeks later when Dorchester College of Medicine in Central Ohio sent me an acceptance letter and a partial scholarship of $14,000 toward the first year of tuition. I called Dr. Adami before I called my mother. Gretchen I did not call at all. Around this same time, Werner sent me a letter, actual paper, in an envelope, which was how Werner communicated anything he considered official, informing me that the family trust's educational distribution had been fully dispersed and that no further allocations would be available. Tessa had drawn an additional $9,000 for a graduate certificate. Burke had apparently incurred some supplemental costs. The $29,000 that might once have helped me was gone. The letter included a line near the end, in Werner's careful bureaucratic prose, that said, "The trustee committee wishes you well in your future endeavors." I still have the letter. I keep it in the same folder as my medical school diploma. I have never decided whether that is ironic or just honest. Dorchester College of Medicine took 4 years and cost me $112,000 in additional federal loans. I worked 12 to 14 hours a week throughout my second and third years as a clinical documentation specialist at Mercy Westfield Hospital, entering and organizing medical records for the cardiology department at $16 an hour. I learned the architecture of a hospital from the inside out before I ever wore a white coat in one professionally. I understood how medical records moved through a system, where they stalled, which documentation errors caused downstream billing failures, and how insurance policy language could be weaponized against patients who didn't know what they were signing. That knowledge would matter later. It mattered in ways I could not have predicted from a billing office at 22. My second year at Dorchester, I failed my first shelf exam, pharmacology. I failed it by 4 points, which is both close enough to be humiliating and far enough to be unambiguous. I retook it 6 weeks later and scored 11 points above passing, but those 6 weeks were among the most honest 6 weeks of my life. I sat with the possibility that I had made a very expensive mistake. I sat with it every morning. I made flashcards at 2 in the morning in my apartment kitchen. I ate cereal for dinner 4 nights a week because I did not have the cognitive capacity to make actual food. I thought about Gretchen exactly once, in the middle of week 3, and the thought was not about her judgment. The thought was that if I walked away now, I would be handing her a conclusion she had already written, and I was not willing to do that. I passed. I moved on. I graduated from Dorchester in June, 11 years after Gretchen's dinner table, and I did not invite any member of my family to the ceremony. Dr. Ademi came. He drove 4 hours from Calder with his wife, Enkechi, and they sat in the third row, and when I crossed the stage and looked out at the audience, their faces were the ones I found first. That memory has never left me. Residency placement came 2 weeks after graduation. I matched at Whitmore Regional Medical Center in Ridgecroft, Ohio for an internal medicine residency. Whitmore was not a glamour placement. It was a mid-sized regional hospital with a strong community care reputation and a residency program that was known, among people who knew these things, for producing physicians who could actually function under pressure rather than physicians who looked good on a departmental brochure. My program director was Dr. Susan Calloway Park, a 51-year-old internist who had the professional demeanor of someone who had been asked every question twice and was prepared to be patient about it exactly one more time. She recognized something in my background, the billing work, the medical records documentation, the specific way I talked about care coordination, and she assigned me to the hospital's complex case management rotation in my second year, a placement typically reserved for third-year residents. "You think differently about systems than most of your cohort," she told me in her office in October of my second year. That's not a compliment yet, it's an observation. Whether it becomes a compliment depends on what you do with it. I did my third-year elective in pulmonology. I chose it because the Whitmore Pulmonology Department was led by Dr. Hamish Ackafer, who had published extensively on chronic respiratory disease management in underserved populations, and who, I had been told by 3 separate attending physicians, was the most technically demanding supervisor in the hospital, and therefore the best teacher available if you were willing to survive the experience. Dr. Ackafer had a habit of asking questions mid-procedure that had nothing to do with the procedure, and everything to do with whether you understood what the procedure was in the context of the patient's entire clinical picture. I answered his questions correctly on March 14th of my third year, during a bronchoscopy on a 63-year-old patient named Gerald Fitch, and Dr. Ackafer looked up from the scope and said, without ceremony, "You should consider fellowships in pulmonary and critical care. I will write you a letter if you decide you want one." He wrote the letter. I completed my internal medicine residency in 3 years. I applied for a combined pulmonary and critical care fellowship. I matched at Whitmore for the fellowship, an unusual placement, a resident matching back to the same institution, and Dr. Callaway Park told me at the match celebration that she had quietly advocated for me to the fellowship committee and that I should not tell anyone she had done so, which I did not until just now. The fellowship was 3 years. I worked harder than I had worked at any prior point, including Pharmacology Retake Month, and I say that with the full awareness of what Pharmacology Retake Month was. I published 2 papers during the fellowship, one on ventilator protocol compliance in community hospitals, which appeared in the Journal of Respiratory Care in November of my second fellowship year, and one on insurance policy denial patterns for pulmonary rehabilitation referrals, which I co-authored with a health economist named Dr. Patricia Afalabi at the University of Ridgecroft, and which, I was told by 3 people who understood these things better than I did, was cited in a Medicare appeals brief the following year. I kept that information in a folder alongside Werner's letter and my diploma. The fellowship ended in June of that year. Dr. Akaffer retired 4 months later. I was appointed attending physician, pulmonary and critical care, Whitmore Regional Medical Center, effective the 1st of October. I was 37 years old. On the evening of my appointment, after the paperwork was signed, and the department had done the particular awkward thing departments do when they are acknowledging a transition without quite knowing how to celebrate it, I drove to a parking overlook above the city and sat in my car for 45 minutes. I was not crying. I was not triumphant. I was doing something quieter than either of those things. I was sitting with the specific weight of the gap between what I had been told I was and what I had become, and I was trying to understand how much of the journey had happened because of Gretchen's table and how much had happened in spite of it, and I decided after 45 minutes that the distinction did not matter and I was going home. I called Dr. Adami on the drive. He picked up on the second ring. "It happened," I said. "I know," he said. "Susan Callaway Park told me 3 days ago." "She said not to call you until you called me." I laughed. I had not laughed in what felt like a week. "Tell her I said thank you," I said. "Tell her yourself," he said. "She wants to have dinner." In the years that followed, I built a clinical practice that became, without any design on my part, a place where complex cases came when no one else knew what to do with them. Patients arrived at Whitmore having been through 3 or 4 other institutions, carrying folders of medical records with documentation gaps that I recognized immediately because I had once spent 3 years filling documentation gaps for other physicians. I could read an incomplete chart the way some people read a face. I knew what was missing before I knew what was there. I knew how insurance policy denials were written and therefore how to appeal them. I knew what a specialist appointment referral needed to say to survive a pre-authorization review. I had come to medicine through its administrative skeleton, and I understood the skeleton in a way that physicians who had come through the front door sometimes did not. My department coordinator, a 39-year-old woman named Felicity Arroyo Kim, had been with the pulmonary department for 6 years when I arrived as attending, and had served under 2 previous supervising physicians, both of whom she described, in her precise and restrained way, as adequate. She told me in my first week that she had reviewed my fellowship publication on insurance denial patterns before I arrived and had printed it out and left it on the desk of the hospital's patient advocacy director with a note that said simply, "She's coming here." Felicity was the person at Whitmore who knew the most about my professional history because she had researched it before she met me. She also knew because I told her directly in the second month the broad shape of why I had come to medicine late and through whom I had not received support. "Did you ever tell them what you became?" she asked. "No," I said. "Are you going to?" "Not until I have a reason to," I said. She nodded as though this were a perfectly logical professional strategy, which, in my experience, it was. My 6-year anniversary at Whitmore as attending, I was asked to lead a case review panel for the hospital's Quality Assurance Committee. The panel reviewed 12 cases involving pulmonary complications that had arisen from delayed diagnosis or documentation failure. I presented for 40 minutes. The committee chair, Dr. Renata Szymanski, the chief of medicine, asked me afterward whether I would consider a formal clinical leadership role within the department. I told her I needed to think about it. I was thinking about it 3 weeks later when Sandra Ochoa stopped by my office at the end of a shift and told me that she had received a call from a family physician in Harwick, a town 30 miles east of Ridgecroft. A town I knew because it was where my Aunt Gretchen and Roland Pfeiffer had lived for 30 years, inquiring about a referral for a pulmonary consultation. The patient's name had not been given. The referring physician had asked specifically about the availability of the senior specialist in pulmonary and critical care. Sandra had confirmed my availability. Did the referring physician give a name for the patient? I asked. Not yet, Sandra said. The intake form comes through tomorrow. Let me know when it does, I said. I went home. I made dinner. I sat at my kitchen table with a glass of water and thought about a dining room table 22 years earlier and a woman who had said my name the way you say the name of a child who has drawn on the walls. I had come that close to everything surfacing before it was time, but it wasn't time yet. The intake form arrived at 7:06 the following morning. Sandra brought it to me at the nurse's station at 7:14 without comment. She had learned to read me well enough to know when something required silence. The name on the chart was Gretchen Voss. I set the chart down. I picked up my coffee. I took one slow sip. And I thought about $43,000 in loans, and a piece of paper folded in a wallet, and a parking overlook above a city where I had sat alone on the best night of my life, and Patricia Coe's voice on the phone the day her husband's insurance coverage was reinstated, and Dr. Adami in the third row. I thought about all of it for exactly as long as it took to finish the coffee. Then I picked up the chart, and I walked down the hall toward room 312, and I opened the door. Gretchen Voss was sitting up in the hospital bed when I opened the door to room 312. She was wearing a blue cardigan over the hospital gown. Someone had brought it from home, which told me she had been here long enough to have a visitor, and she had the particular posture of a woman who had spent her entire life being the most important person in every room she entered, and had not yet registered that this room was different. She looked at me. I watched the recognition move across her face in stages. The first stage was the ordinary assessment of a stranger in a white coat. The second stage was something slower, a retrieval process, the way you reach for a word you haven't used in decades. The third stage was the arrival. Mara, she said. Good morning, Mrs. Pfeiffer, I said. I'm Dr. Voss. I'll be your attending physician for pulmonary services. Sandra has already completed your intake. I'd like to review your imaging with you this morning. I pulled the rolling stool from the corner of the room, sat down, and opened her chart. She said nothing for 4 seconds. I counted. You're a doctor, she said. I am, I said. I did not look up from the chart. Roland was in the chair by the window. He was older than I remembered, heavier, his hair gone mostly white, and he was looking at me with an expression I could not immediately classify. It was not hostility. It was not warmth. It was the expression of a man trying to recalculate something he had assumed was already solved. How long have you been here? Gretchen asked. At this hospital. 11 years, I said. I turned a page in the chart. Your referring physician has documented symptoms going back approximately 8 weeks. I want to walk you through what the CT shows and discuss next steps. Is that all right? She said it was all right. I walked her through the imaging. I used clear language. I was thorough and unhurried, and I answered every question Roland asked without impatience. I was, in that room, exactly the physician I had spent 2 decades becoming, and I was aware, with a steadiness that surprised even me, that this was enough. That being exactly what I was, in exactly this room, was sufficient. I did not need anything else to happen. The fact of it was already complete. But something else was going to happen. I had seen to that 4 months earlier. I scheduled Gretchen's follow-up for the following Thursday, ordered 2 additional labs, and told Sandra to flag the chart for my direct review. As I left the room, Roland stood up from his chair. I do not know why, whether it was instinct or manners or something else, and Gretchen said, Mara, again, and I turned at the door. You look well, she said. It was the best she had, and we both understood it. Thank you, I said. I'll see you Thursday. I walked back to the nurse's station, set the chart down, picked up the next one, and kept working. That evening, I called Felicity Arroyo Kim at 7:15. I told her that the patient had arrived and that I had completed the initial consult. Felicity already knew what the patient's name meant in the context of my history because I had told her 3 months earlier when the intake referral first came through. She listened to my summary without interrupting, which was one of the things I valued most about her. How are you? She asked when I finished. Fine, I said. Clear. What do you need from me? Nothing yet, I said. But I want you to pull Werner Voss's name from the family record when the patient completes her intake authorization. He's listed as the secondary contact. I want to know if he's involved in her care decisions. I'll check tomorrow morning, Felicity said. Thank you, I said. I was not thinking about the clinical picture when I hung up. I was thinking about Werner's letter, the one in the folder with my diploma and the trust documentation, and the conversation I had had 4 months earlier with an estate attorney named Daniel Reyes of Caldwell and Reyes LLP in Ridgecroft. Daniel had been recommended to me by Dr. Patricia Afalabi, my co-author on the insurance denial paper, who had used his firm 2 years prior for a trust dispute involving her own family's assets. I had sat in Daniel's office on a Thursday afternoon in November, and I had laid out, in as organized a manner as I could manage, the complete history of the Voss Family Trust, the $47,000 educational distribution, the fiduciary decision that had denied my access to $29,000 of it, and the question I had been carrying for several years about whether that decision had been made in accordance with the trust's actual governing documents or in accordance with Gretchen's preferences, which were not the same thing. Daniel had listened for 40 minutes. He had asked 5 questions. He had said, "Give me 3 weeks." 3 weeks later, he had called me back and said, "I've reviewed the trust instrument. The distribution decision was not, in my opinion, compliant with the terms as written." The trustee committee had discretion, but discretion is not unlimited authority. There is a question here worth pursuing, depending on what you want the outcome to look like. What I wanted the outcome to look like had required several more conversations. But the first thing I had wanted to do, the thing I had been waiting to do since Werner's letter arrived 22 years earlier, was understand whether what happened had been legal. And Daniel Reyes had told me it was not straightforwardly legal. That was enough to proceed. I called Daniel that evening, after Felicity. I told him Gretchen was now a patient at Whitmore under my direct care. "Does that create a conflict?" he asked. "No," I said. "My clinical obligations are exactly what they would be for any patient. What I do in that room is medicine. What we're doing together is separate." "Agreed," he said. "I've completed the financial disclosure request. Werner's attorney responded yesterday. I'll send you the summary tonight." "I'll read it before morning," I said. I signed the first document that night, at my kitchen table, with the trust instrument Daniel had obtained from the county records office open beside it. There was no going back. The financial disclosure was 41 pages. I read all 41 pages between 9:15 and 11:40 that night, sitting at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, making notes in the margin in the shorthand I had developed over years of reading dense clinical documentation. What the disclosure showed was not dramatic. It was not a single theft or a single fraud. It was something quieter and in some ways worse, a consistent pattern of trust decisions made by the trustee committee over 23 years that had consistently favored distributions to Gretchen and Roland's direct household, to Tessa and Burke, and to a series of administrative expenses that Daniel had flagged as inconsistent with the trust's stated purposes. The educational distribution I had been denied was the smallest number in the document. It was not the most important number. It was, however, the number I had lived with the longest. I called Daniel the next morning and told him to proceed to the next phase. In the meantime, Gretchen attended her Thursday follow-up, and then her Tuesday labs, and then a second imaging review 2 weeks after that. Over the course of 6 weeks of clinical contact, she had settled into what I recognized as a guarded civility, the manner of a person who has been forced to accept an arrangement they did not design and has decided the best available option is to conduct themselves with dignity. She did not ask about my training again. She did not ask about my career. She asked clinical questions. I answered them. Roland occasionally offered context about her symptoms at home. I thanked him for the information. It was medically a functioning patient-physician relationship. The close call came on a Tuesday afternoon in the 4th week, when Roland stopped me in the hallway outside the imaging review room as I was walking to my next appointment. He was alone, which was unusual. He had his hands in the pockets of his jacket, which I recognized as the posture of a man who was about to say something he had rehearsed. "Mara," he said. He had stopped using Dr. Voss somewhere in the 3rd week, which I had noted without commenting on. "Roland," I said, I stopped walking. I had 3 minutes before my next patient. "Werner mentioned that someone from a law firm contacted his attorney," he said. "He didn't have a name. He thought it might be related to some property matter." "Do you know anything about that?" I looked at him for 2 full seconds. I'm not aware of any property matter involving me, I said, which was true. Daniel's inquiry had been framed around trust governance, not property. Roland nodded slowly. He said it might be nothing, a misfiled request. It's possible, I said. I hope Gretchen's appetite has improved. The medication adjustment sometimes takes 10 days to show full effect. Roland blinked. He had been pulled back to the clinical track, which was where I needed him. Yes, he said. She ate a full dinner last night for the first time. Good, I said. That's what we want to see. I walked to my next appointment. That was the moment I understood exactly how much they had underestimated me. By the time Roland stopped me in that hallway, Daniel had already filed the formal petition with the Ridgecroft County Probate Court, requesting a judicial review of the Voss Family Trust Administration over the preceding 23 years. The petition named Werner Voss as the primary trustee respondent and cited 11 specific distribution decisions that Daniel had identified as potentially inconsistent with the trust instrument. Gretchen and Roland were named as interested parties. The petition had been filed under seal pending initial review, which was why Werner's attorney had received only a general inquiry and not the full document. The hearing date was set for March 19th. Gretchen's pulmonary follow-up was scheduled for March 17th. I briefed Felicity on the timeline in her office on the last Wednesday of February, with the door closed and the chart documentation closed, speaking entirely off the record. Felicity listened the way she always listened, with the particular quality of attention that meant she was not just absorbing information, but categorizing it by what would need to happen next. Does she know? Felicity asked. No, I said. Does anyone at the hospital know? Just you, I said. What do you need from me for the hearing? A certified copy of the patient's treatment timeline and my clinical role documentation, I said. Nothing confidential, only what is already part of the institutional record. Daniel may need it to establish the timeline of contact. I'll prepare it, she said. Felicity, I said. She looked at me. You've known me for 11 years, I said. You understand why this has to be done the way it's being done. I understand, she said. I also want you to know that I've watched you walk into that room every week and be exactly the physician she needed. And I think that's the most interesting thing about you, Mara, that you could do both. I did not have an answer for that. I thanked her and went back to work. The week before the hearing, Werner called me directly. I do not know how he obtained my cell number. He had clearly spent some time and effort obtaining it, which told me that Daniel's petition was no longer under seal. Mara, he said when I answered. His voice had the careful quality I remembered from the trust meeting 22 years earlier. The fiduciary voice. I understand there is some legal matter under review. I want you to know that the trustee committee always acted in accordance with our interpretation of your father's intentions. I appreciate you calling, Werner, I said. My attorney has advised me not to discuss the matter directly. I hope you understand. A pause. Is this about the educational distribution? My attorney has advised me not to discuss the matter directly, I said again. Another pause, longer. Mara, your father would not have wanted, Werner, I said. I have a patient in 20 minutes. I hope you're well. Goodbye. I ended the call and set my phone face down on the desk. 2 days before the hearing, I attended Gretchen's final pre-scheduled clinical appointment. I reviewed her most recent pulmonary function tests with her. The numbers were improving. I told her this directly, and she received the information with something that looked, briefly, like relief, and I felt the thing that I always felt when a patient's trajectory turned. A clean, uncomplicated satisfaction that had nothing to do with anything except the fact that the medicine was working. I made 3 notes in her chart. I ordered a follow-up in 6 weeks. I wished her a good afternoon. She thought she had won, the version of this story she was telling herself. She had 2 more days. The hearing at Ridgecroft County Probate Court was scheduled for 9 o'clock on March 19th in Courtroom 4 before Judge Marguerite Olafson-Webb. I arrived at 8:30 with Daniel Reyes, who was carrying a litigation bag that contained, among other things, the certified trust instrument, the 23-year distribution ledger, the financial disclosure documents, the 11 flagged distribution decisions with supporting analysis, a certified copy of the original educational distribution denial minutes dated to the meeting at Gretchen's dining room table, and a signed letter from Dr. Susan Calloway Park. Now retired and serving as an emeritus advisor to Whitmore's medical education program, attesting to the timeline of my training and appointment. The letter from Dr. Calloway Park had not been my idea. It had been Daniel's. He had said that establishing the professional record in full would provide the court with context for the scope of the harm. I had called Dr. Calloway Park and asked her directly. She had said, without hesitation, "Send me the draft, I'll sign it." The courtroom was not large. It held perhaps 60 seats. By 9 o'clock, 51 of them were occupied. Werner arrived with his attorney, a man named Philip Grout of Grout and Associates, who had the practiced calm of a litigator who had reviewed the petition and concluded that the exposure was manageable. Werner himself was dressed with the precision of a man who had decided his appearance was the last variable he could control. He sat in the front row behind the respondent's table and did not look at me when I entered. Gretchen and Roland arrived at 8:55. Roland was guiding Gretchen by the elbow. Her pulmonary capacity still limited her on exertion, and when she saw me seated at the petitioner's table beside Daniel, she stopped walking. I saw it. The stop, the recalibration, the resumption. 3 seconds of her finally understanding what room she was in. Tessa and Burke were in the fourth row. Tessa looked pale. Burke had the expression of a man who had spoken to an attorney recently and had not liked what the attorney had said. Dr. Patricia Afalabi was in the eighth row. She was not there in any official capacity. She had asked if she could attend, and I had told her she was welcome. Her presence was the only thing in the room that morning that felt like it was purely for me. Judge Olafson Webb entered at 9:02 and called the proceeding to order with the unhurried efficiency of a judge who had seen every variety of family trust dispute and had opinions about all of them that she kept rigorously to herself. Philip Grout opened for the respondent. His argument was what I had expected. The trustee committee had exercised its discretion reasonably, in good faith, consistent with the settlor's general intent, and the petition represented a retrospective reinterpretation of decisions that had been made lawfully at the time. He spoke for 11 minutes. He was composed and specific, and he made the case as well as it could be made. Daniel opened for me. He spoke for 9 minutes. He established the trust instrument's specific language regarding educational distributions. Language that required the committee to evaluate applications against a standard of academic merit, not against a standard of institutional prestige, and he introduced the distribution denial minutes, which showed that the committee's recorded basis for denial had referenced my community college transcript and non-traditional academic path, rather than any academic merit evaluation, as the instrument defined it. He then introduced the comparative distribution record, which showed that in the same period, Tessa had received $18,000 for a program that had never required a merit evaluation, and Burke had received $22,000 through an undocumented arrangement that did not appear in the formal distribution minutes at all. That was the first document. I had 3 more. The second document was a financial analysis prepared by a forensic accountant named Dr. Renata Szymanski, not the same doctor. Szymanski as my chief of medicine, a coincidence of surname, who had reviewed the trust's 23-year ledger and identified a cumulative total of $108,000 in administrative expense distributions that lacked supporting documentation under the trust's accounting requirements. $108,000 that had flowed, over 2 decades, to an account in Werner's name described in the ledger as trustee compensation and administrative overhead, without any corresponding authorization from the trust instrument, which did not provide for trustee compensation. Werner's hands, which had been folded on the table in front of him, went very still. Philip Grout said, "Your Honor, we would request an opportunity to respond to this exhibit as we have not." "You'll have your opportunity, Mr. Grout," Judge Olafson Webb said, without looking up from the document. The third document was the certified letter from Dr. Calloway Park, establishing the full timeline of my medical education, training, and appointment at Whitmore Regional Medical Center. Daniel introduced it not as evidence of harm, but as evidence of outcome, of what the trust's denial had failed to prevent. He stated, calmly and without dramatics, that the petitioner had proceeded without family support, had financed her education independently through federal loans totaling $155,000, had completed residency and fellowship training, and had served as an attending physician at Whitmore for 11 years, during which time she had, among other things, served as the treating physician for one of the trust's own named beneficiaries. He let that last sentence sit in the room for 3 full seconds before moving on. I looked at the wall above the judge's bench. I kept my hands flat on the notepad in front of me. Gretchen said from her seat in the gallery, "Roland." Just the name, nothing else. Her voice had changed. It had the quality of a voice that has run out of its usual register and is operating below it. "Mrs. Pfeiffer," Judge Olafson Webb said, without heat. "You'll have an opportunity to speak through counsel if you choose to make a statement. Please hold your comments." Roland put his hand over hers. She did not seem to notice. The fourth document was the one that had required the most work, and that I had thought about the most carefully before authorizing Daniel to introduce it. It was a letter I had written myself, 3 months earlier, on a Saturday morning at my kitchen table, revised 4 times over the following 2 weeks, and reviewed by Daniel for legal sufficiency. It was addressed to the court and described, in plain and specific language, the experience of attending Gretchen's dinner table at 26 years old, the specific statements that had been made, the trust distribution denial, the decision to finance my own education, and the 22 years during which I had built a medical career without family support and without telling the family what I had built. It contained one sentence that I had written in the fourth revision and had not changed. I did not pursue this matter when I had less. I pursued it now because the documentation supports it, and because I believe that what was taken from me was taken deliberately, by people who had the authority to give it and chose not to. Judge Olafson Webb read the letter in full. The courtroom was very quiet. When she finished, she set it down and looked at Werner. "Mr. Voss," she said, "your counsel will have the opportunity to respond fully, but I want to ask you directly, as a preliminary matter, are the distribution figures in the petitioner's financial analysis disputed by the respondent?" Philip Grout began to rise. "Mr. Grout," the judge said, "I asked Mr. Voss." Werner looked at his attorney. He looked at the judge. He had the expression of a man who has spent 23 years being the most careful person in every financial room he entered, and has just understood that careful and correct are not the same word. "Some figures may require clarification," Werner said. "That is not a dispute," Judge Olafson Webb said. The proceeding continued for 2 more hours. Philip Grout mounted a competent defense of the educational distribution decisions specifically, and Judge Olafson Webb acknowledged that the committee's discretion over that particular decision, while exercised in a manner inconsistent with the instrument's merit standard, was not straightforwardly actionable at this remove from the original decision. That portion of the claim, she indicated, might not survive to final judgment. The administrative expense distributions were a different matter. $108,000 over 23 years, drawn from a trust account to a trustee's personal account without authorization, was not a discretion question. It was a documentation question, and the documentation did not exist. Judge Olafson Webb ordered a full accounting of the trust's administrative expenses for the preceding 23 years to be completed within 60 days. She appointed an independent fiduciary examiner. She ordered Werner to produce all personal financial records relating to the trustee compensation account within 30 days. She did not issue a final judgment that day. She did not need to. The order she issued was the mechanism. The judgment would follow the accounting. As the proceeding concluded, and the gallery began to move, Dr. Afalabi found me in the corridor outside the courtroom. She did not say anything immediately. She put her hand briefly on my arm, and I understood that as the complete communication it was. Felicity texted at 11:17, "How did it go?" I texted back, "The accounting is ordered." She replied, "Good." I put my phone in my pocket and walked with Daniel to the parking structure, and we debriefed for 20 minutes in the cold morning air beside his car, and then I drove back to Whitmore for afternoon clinic, because I had 3 patients scheduled and they were not part of this story, and they needed a physician who was present and clear and thinking only about them. I was that physician. I had been for 11 years. I remained so that afternoon, and the afternoon after that. The accounting was completed in 58 days. The independent fiduciary examiner, a certified public accountant named Gerald Huang of the Ridgecroft firm Huang and Osai, identified $114,000 in undocumented trust disbursements, 6,000 more than Daniel's initial estimate. He also identified 3 instances where beneficiary distributions had been recorded in the minutes under one family member's name and dispersed to a different account, a discrepancy that Philip Grout, in his response brief, described as administrative errors consistent with informal trust management practices, which is a sentence I read 3 times and still found remarkable. The legal settlement was reached in July, 4 months after the initial hearing. The settlement was structured by agreement between Daniel and Philip Grout under Judge Olafsson Webb's supervision. Werner agreed to repay $114,000 to the trust corpus, plus a calculated interest figure of $31,000 based on the period of undocumented disbursement. He resigned as trustee. An independent trustee was appointed, a firm in Columbus that specialized in estate administration. The trust documents were formally amended to clarify the educational distribution criteria. I received, from the restituted trust corpus, a distribution of $29,000 representing the original denied educational allocation, with interest calculated from the date of denial, totaling $41,200. It was not the largest number in the settlement. It was the first. I deposited it on a Thursday afternoon and called Dr. Adami on the drive home. I told him in general terms what had happened. He was 71 years old and had been in partial retirement for 2 years, still teaching one biochemistry section at Calder. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do with it?" he asked. "I've already done it," I said. "I started a scholarship fund at Calder 2 months ago. For non-traditional pre-medical students, the first distribution goes out in September." He did not say anything for several seconds. "Lionel," I said. "Give me a moment," he said. I gave him a moment. "What are you going to call it?" he asked. "The Adami Scholarship," I said. "I already filed the paperwork. I should have asked your permission. I didn't. I apologize for that." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else. "You've been making unilateral decisions since you were 26, he said. "I don't know why I expected this to be different." I continued Gretchen's clinical care through the summer and into the fall. Her pulmonary function improved steadily. We never discussed the hearing. We never discussed the settlement. We sat in the clinic room on Thursday afternoons and reviewed her numbers and discussed her symptoms, and I answered Roland's questions, and I scheduled her follow-ups, and I remained exactly what I had been from the first morning she saw me in room 312, her physician. I do not know what she made of that. I did not ask. She sent me a card in September. It arrived at the hospital, addressed to Dr. M. Voss with a Harwick postmark. The card had a painted landscape on the front, autumn trees, and inside in Gretchen's handwriting, which I recognized from a birthday card she had sent me when I was 9, were the words, "Thank you for your care this year. It has meant more than I know how to say." I read it twice. I set it on my desk. I did not respond, and I did not discard it. I placed it in the folder that already held Werner's letter, my diploma, and the trust distribution notice. The folder is in my desk drawer at home. I have not opened it since September. I do not think about it every day. I think about it when I need to remember what it cost, and then I close the drawer and go back to work. Burke did not finish the trust settlement proceedings without his own complications. His undocumented $22,000 distribution was separately scrutinized under the accounting, and he spent 4 months, and a considerable amount of his own money in legal fees, before his portion of the matter was resolved as an administrative correction rather than a malfeasance finding, which I understand was the best available outcome for him, and which I had no position on either way. Tessa called me once in April from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. She said she hoped I was well and that she thought the situation had been handled, on my side, with more class than she would have expected. She did not leave her number. I did not call back. Werner, as of the last communication from Daniel in October, was cooperating with the repayment schedule and had not initiated any further legal contact. His resignation as trustee was permanent. The Columbus firm had taken over the administration and was, by all accounts, managing the trust in strict accordance with its terms. The remaining trust corpus was sufficient to fund the educational distributions for the foreseeable future, plus a small additional reserve for administrative costs. The trust documents reflected this clearly. My life, in the months since the settlement, has continued to be primarily about medicine. I was appointed Associate Director of the Pulmonary and Critical Care Division at Whitmore Regional in August, a role that Dr. Renata Szymanski, my Chief of Medicine, had suggested twice before I accepted it. Felicity has taken on expanded responsibilities with the division. Sandra Ochoa, received a commendation from the nursing department for her role in a complex case coordination effort we ran in the spring, and I wrote her recommendation personally. Dr. Ackefer, now fully retired, attended the scholarship ceremony at Calder in September, where the first Adami Scholar was announced. A 28-year-old woman from Dayton named Christina Bubakar, who had spent 6 years as a medical interpreter, before deciding she wanted to be the physician doing the talking. She wore the same expression at the ceremony that I imagine I wore when Helen Marsh walked me through my financial aid options over the phone 23 years earlier. The expression of someone who has understood that the door is open. I think about Gretchen sometimes in a way that is harder to describe than the straightforward account I've given you. I think about what it means to be a person who looks at a 26-year-old woman with a community college transcript and sees a conclusion rather than a beginning. I think about what kind of fear that requires: fear of being wrong about a person, fear of the cost of being wrong, fear that generosity extended to someone you have underestimated will somehow diminish what you kept for yourself. I do not think Gretchen was a simple villain. I think she was a frightened person with power and a rigid understanding of who deserved it. That does not change what happened. It does not reduce what it cost me. But I carry it as part of the honest account, because the honest account is the only one I know how to tell. And if there is anything this experience taught me, it is this. 1. The most powerful thing you can do when someone tells you what you are worth is go build your evidence in silence and let the record speak for itself. 2. Documentation is not bureaucracy. It is memory that cannot be revised, and the person who keeps the best record of what happened will always outlast the person who counted on everyone forgetting. 3. You do not become who you are to prove them wrong. You become who you are because the work was always yours, and no one can retroactively own what they refused to invest in. Was I wrong to treat Gretchen as my patient, to provide her with the same care I would have given anyone, while simultaneously preparing a legal case against her family? Tell me in the comments. If this story gave you strength, hit that like button. It means more than you know.